Welcome to Disciples of Christ History. My name is Steve Regas. I'm a member here at Liberty Christian Church in Liberty, Missouri. I am leading a 15-week series on the history of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I've been asked to say a little bit how this series came about. A few of you may know that I'm currently working on a book called Seeking Christ. It's about the difference between liberal Christians and conservative Christians. In the end, it will suggest at least, to find a way to bridge their differences. In working on that book, I recently completed a pretty long chapter on the history of Christianity. The second factor is that Dave Culver, the pastor of this congregation, asked me last summer to teach a series on the history of the disciples of Christ, as there were a fair number of members of this congregation who really weren't aware of that. The third factor came in, and this got the region involved. I'm currently mentoring a candidate for commissioning in the region. And as part of the process, he has to take a class in the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. Unfortunately, there's no really good local option for that. And in speaking with the region, they said if he watches this series, it would fulfill that criteria for him, but they would also like to put it on the regional website for anyone else who wanted to study the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. I am honored to have you as my guest for this, and thank you for being here. Now I have a disclaimer this week before I take my mask off. I was not in a fight. Although it looks like Kellen got to me, I have several pre-malignant skin lesions that did not respond to freezing, so now I'm being treated chemically. Oh. Yeah. And so the question to ask is, how did the other guy look? Yeah. I turned out great. Yeah, if you and I went at it, I'd look a whole lot worse than this. They come to America. You may recognize this song. Far, we've been traveling far, without a home, but not without a star. Free, only want to be free. We huddle close, hang on to the dream. On a boat and on the plains, they're coming to America. Never looking back again, they're coming to America. Home, don't it seem so far away? Oh, we're traveling light today, in the eye of the storm, in the eye of the storm. Home to a new and shiny place. Make our bed and say our grace. Freedom's light burning warm. Freedom's light burning warm. Everywhere around the world, they're coming to America. Every time that flag's unfurled, they're coming to America. That was, of course, Neil Diamond, talking about immigrants. So I have a question here, just a show of hands. Is anybody here a naturalized citizen? Okay. So none of us are Americans by choice. And I'm guessing that as such, there are things about the experience of coming to America, seeking a new life and freedom here that none of us would understand. But even if we had a naturalized citizen here today, their experience would have been very different than what it meant to come here, say, in 1795 or 1805 or 1815. Most people I know who come and become citizens don't say goodbye to their families for good. They fly back and see them. The families come here and see them. They're on the internet. They can FaceTime them. Was that true in 1805? Probably the only chance you'd ever get to see the loved ones you left behind is if they immigrated here. And I don't know how long it took for mail to get, but I'm sure that it was pretty slow. Indeed, as we'll talk more about next week, when Thomas Campbell came to his new convictions, his son back in the old country didn't know about it till he showed up on these shores. I had you pull out dollar bills last week and read the words Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages. And people truly believed that when they came here, that this was something new, something different, and that something was happening here, freedom, in so many ways that had never been experienced, at least on a large scale in the world. And part of that was, of course, freedom of religion. Last week we closed by me saying that in America, in the years between the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 and the start of the Great Awakening in the West, 1801, that religion in America was in a pretty low state. Maybe 5 to 10% at the most went to church. And those that believed in God, many of them were deists. The presidents were deists. People who believed in a watchmaker God who eons ago set the world in motion and then wiped God's hands and said, "You're on your own." The idea of a personal God who was involved in everyday life, whose son was Jesus Christ, was not necessarily very popular. And then something happened that would keep America traditional for most of the next century. There's something called the Second Great Awakening. Now, there was the First Great Awakening years before in America. I've glossed over that. The Second Great Awakening started, it had two phases. There was a phase in the Northeast that happened in the late 1790s. Now, most of the famous schools, Harvard, Princeton, many of those were founded by churches. And their professors had many of them had become deists. Hey, there's a God. God keeps God's hands off. You should follow Jesus because he's a great moral teacher. But the Son of God? No way. Miracles? No way. Many of these schools were filled with professors who taught that. And then something happened. The first phase of the Second Great Awakening was that in the colleges of the Northeast, the professors began to experience religion for themselves. And they went from being deists to people who believed in a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, who was God's Son and who played an important part in this world. That was the first phase of the Great Awakening. Now, if you've ever looked at a map of where Disciples of Christ churches are there many in New England? No. I had a friend who graduated from seminary, and he became pastor of the only disciple church in Massachusetts. And that part of the Great Awakening really did not affect us. But it's the western phase that played a huge part. And just as the world was not ready for the legalization of Christianity or the Reformation, so the frontier of America could never have predicted the awakening in the West that happened starting about 1800, 1801. And it's at this point that the history of the disciples of Christ in and of itself actually begins. We start off today with the work of a man named Barton W. Stone. And it's somewhat ironic that I talk about immigrants and talk about Barton Stone, because of the four founders, he was the only one who wasn't an immigrant. Indeed, he was born in 1772. He was a fifth-generation American. He was born in Maryland to a fairly well-off family. They were nominally Episcopalian, not very active. And again, he started off fairly well off in life. My friend Newell Williams, who all the ministers who see this know, in his book, and this is, if you want to know about the disciples of Christ, read this book. It's an encyclopedia, And anything you want to know, it's in there. In his great article in there, you've heard about American society being upwardly mobile. Barton Stone was downwardly mobile. All of us remember the story of the prodigal son. And remember, the son took half of his inheritance, and what did he do with it? He squandered it in riotous living. Barton Stone took his part of the inheritance, and you know what he did with it? He paid to go to college. Now, his original plan when he entered David Caldwell's Log Academy was that he was going to go to college and become a lawyer. And if he had done that, it might have paid off. But while he was there, he went from being a nominal Presbyterian to an active Presbyterian. He got religion and decided that he had a calling to the ministry. And financially, things kind of went downhill from there. Part of the reason it was he had 11 children. Yeah, 5 by the first wife, 6 by the second. And his first wife, I mean, they'd only been married like 9 years and had like 5 kids when she passed. And they had a son who died in infancy, and then he had 4 daughters who he apparently boarded with members of his church. He got his education. I believe he graduated about 1793. And in 1796, he was licensed to be what we would today call commissioned to be a Presbyterian minister. He was kind of in probationary period that, okay, Stone, let's see what you got. So he visited small rural churches and preached. Now, something about Barton Stone. There are people in life, if you say, the sun is shining, they'll believe you. And there are people in life, if you say the sun is shining, they'll go to the window and see if it's true. We've talked about before how Christianity is in some ways a series of illogical propositions. That we say that God is one and yet God is three. And that's not possible. Those kind of issues bothered Barton Stone. I think we've all met people who stew over things. And we may be the kind who stew over things. It's just like, I can't get my mind around this. And he'd come to a conclusion and then he'd change his mind. Now, if you're, all of us, we're in a great position. We're disciples of Christ. We can believe what we want. But what if you're Presbyterian? Now, you can believe what you want if you're in the pews. But if you're a pastor, what do you have to believe in?
Predestination.
Well, predestination's part of it, and that will come into it. But the bigger thing is the Westminster Confession. That is the statement of faith for Presbyterians. And so he was assigned to read this. And the more he read it, the more upset he got. Because there were things like the Trinity that in his logical mind didn't make sense. And let's talk about predestination. What does that mean? That before the world began, before any of us were ever created, before we were a gleam in our mother's eyes, that God already knew who we were, and God had already decided, you're going to heaven, you're going to hell. You're going to heaven, you're going to hell. Think of the thing with the daisy, she loves me not. And even if you don't believe in predestination, it is an interesting topic. Because if you believe that God is omniscient, that God knows everything, then even if God doesn't choose, isn't God going to know who becomes a part of the kingdom and who doesn't? The thing that bothered Stone most about the Presbyterian belief of predestination was the idea of limited atonement. Is anybody here going to be the elder at the table today? I would almost bet you money that they're going to say, thank you for dying for our sins on the cross. Don't you think that'll come up? But for whom did Jesus die? For us? What about the people who don't know him? Did he die for them? You're not Presbyterians. There's in Calvinism, and I'm not even sure if most Presbyterians would believe this today, but in Stone's day, they believed in something called limited atonement. And it plays into the idea of predestination like this. You're going to be saved, you're not going to be saved. You're going to be saved, you're not going to be saved. And they would take that a step further. Who did Jesus die for? Did he die for the saved? Yes. Did he die for the unsaved? No. And that's a discussion for another day, but it's like one of the ideas was irresistible grace. That, say I was one of the elect. I was destined to be saved. And I was rotten. I was rotten. Looked like I was in a fight every night. If I was part of the elect, it didn't matter how bad Steve was. God's grace was irresistible. And in the end, no matter how hard I tried, God's going to get me. Does that make sense? Those kind of things bothered Barton Stone, as they would bother a lot of us. So he was a pretty good preacher. And in 1798, there was two yoke churches, Concord and Cane Ridge, Kentucky, that decided they wanted him to be their full-time pastor. But here's the catch. He's only licensed. He's not ordained. For him to be the full-time permanent minister, he's going to have to be ordained. Now, we don't do this in ordinations, kind of, but you know, when you're ordained the disciples of Christ, you meet with the regional committee on the ministry. And mine took about 45 minutes. And golly, I wish med school interviews were that easy. And part of it was I had grown up disciple and gone to a disciple seminary, so they weren't, I was in the fold. Maybe people, I've been told that people who come from other backgrounds may get a little more inquisitive. But that's not how the Presbyterians did it. I mean, it was a full, sit down here, son, we're going to ask you some questions. And one of the questions that came up was, do you believe in the Westminster Confession? And Stone was an honest man, honest to a fault. He said something like, I do as long as it agrees with my belief in the Bible. And they took that. They took that. Some of you, we in about 6 or 7 weeks, we'll get to the story about the fundamentalists and the modernists and the disciples of Christ. My seminary, Bright Divinity School, was going through that transition in the early 1920s. Bright Divinity School got its name from a man named Lucas Bright, who gave the school $25,000 to start. It got named after him. I mean, you could never get a school named after you for $25,000 today. But he was quite a fundamentalist, and he was quite involved in the governance of this college that bore his name. And very contrary to disciple tradition, there was a statement of faith that Mr. Bright said all the professors had to sign. And they hired a new professor in the 20s, and they said, doctor, sign this. And he looked at it and said, I don't know about this. So what he did was sign it. And they showed that to Mr. Bright. What they didn't show to Mr. Bright was on a separate piece of paper, he had all of his reservations. But that was in the Barton Stone tradition. I agree with it as much as I can. But despite his hedging, they said, okay, you can be a minister. Then came the great revival in the West. And this primarily occurred by camp meetings. Let me find, this is from An Invitation to Church History American by John Hannah. This is an evangelical book, by the way, not a disciple book. Stone had gone into a camp meeting that would last 3, 4, 5, 6 days, and there would be people, multiple preachers there, multiple denominations. And as it says in one book, it didn't matter your education, it didn't matter your denomination. It's just if you could persuade people. I mean, this is America. It's not about your credentials as much as it's about your ability to do the job. The largest of the frontier camp meetings took place at Cane Ridge near Lexington, Kentucky, August 6th through 11th, 1801. The stated number of attendees has varied significantly, but numbers suggest between 10 and 25,000. That's a tenth of the population of Kentucky at the time. This was a big deal. Numerous ministers attended along with lay exhorters, making for a colorful spectacle as bountiful gifts of the Spirit became manifest in the meetings, such as fainting or the falling exercises, jerking and voluntary bodily movements, and barking exercise or treeing the devil. It lasted for 6 days. And, if people were tired of, the old stale Lutheran and Catholic and Anglican churches back in Europe and wanted something new, different, and exciting, by golly, they got it. And this appeal to the heart to find Christ resonated with people. Now, so the meeting broke up, but this was at Cane Ridge. Who was the Presbyterian pastor at Cane Ridge? Barton Stone. He was the host pastor for the greatest meeting in the Western frontier. And again, what religion is he? Presbyterian. And true story. My wife, Shauna, I met her in a disciple church, but we got married, she was Presbyterian. And one of my best friends was a Presbyterian pastor. When I told him I was marrying her, he thought I was converting. And so he starts telling me, he goes, being a Presbyterian is a way of order and decency. And that's kind of one of their catchphrases, order and decency. Was the Cane Ridge revival either orderly or decent? No. And even though it got a lot of people saved into the fold, whatever you want to call it, there were folks who weren't happy. Because not only was it different, but who were they working with? Methodists, Baptists. And that didn't quite fit in with the Presbyterian idea of order and decency. So about 1803, Barton W. Stone and 4 of his Presbyterian minister friends were called before the presbytery. And they were basically told, why did you do this? Now, you've always heard stories about somebody who gets called into the boss and says, you're fired. And their response is, you can't fire me because I quit 3 minutes ago. That's kind of what happened to Stone and his 5 friends. They realized that this was a kangaroo court, that they were going to be kicked out, and they said, forget it. You can't kick us out. We're quitting now. So they were out of the presbytery, but they still considered themselves to be Presbyterians, just kind of non-fellowshipped ones. So they started their own. the Springfield Presbytery. Let me get a drink and look something up first. In 1803, Barton Stone, his 4 minister friends who left before being kicked out, they started the Springfield Presbytery. They got another individual to join them, and they got about 15 churches within a year to say, hey, we like your ideas. We like what you're doing. And then as they studied further, they studied the Bible further, they realized that maybe this whole Presbyterian thing was wrong. They still considered themselves good Presbyterians, even if the real Presbyterians didn't. I was thinking about Animal House. They were like on double secret probation. In 1804, they did something interesting, something kind of odd. Some of us, in anticipation of the day we're gone, have written wills. And what's the formal name of a will? The last will and testament. And you know, basically you go down and leave stuff. The 5 original guys and the one that joined later wrote something called the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery. And they did it in the form of a will, like, you know, we will our presbytery to die. And we get rid of the human innovations. We get rid of the creeds. This document is one of the founding documents of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And I suspect if you get online and put in Last Will and Testament of Springfield Presbytery, you could read it in detail. It's maybe a page and a half long. They decided at that point that they were simply going to be Christians, and Christians only. And that idea took off. In 1805, the Christians and the 6 ministers who led it, they had their first trial. Has anybody ever heard of the Shakers? What do you know about the Shakers? They have, you know how we're working on getting a children's ministry? That would have been really hard on Shakers. Because if you became a Shaker, it didn't matter whether you're married or not, you could have no sex ever. And so they were abstinent. So, you know, they didn't have a lot of kids. That's one of the problems being a Shaker, is that you have to recruit a whole new church every generation. Of the six Presbyterian ministers, 2 of them left the fold to become Shakers. And for a while, the Shakers were an incredibly popular idea. That put a severe test on the church. But they continued on, and they began to grow. Now, something we've seen again and again and again. When Constantine freed Christianity, made it legal, what's the first thing he wanted to do? He didn't like the idea that some people believed one thing and some people believed another. So what did he do? He had the church write a creed. And so you get to the Reformation, and there's all these creeds and statements of the Catholic Church, and you know, Luther and Calvinists, like, we're going back to the Bible. We want to be free of those creeds. So what did they do? Yeah, we've already talked about the Presbyterians. The Calvinists had the Westminster Confession. The Lutherans had the Book of Concord. The Anglicans had the 39 Articles. It started all over again. And again, why are these guys there? Why did they leave the Presbyterian Church to start their own? They didn't want creeds. Well, let's do a little math, though. There were 5 original guys that got kicked out. 1 guy joined them. 2 of them became Shakers. And at some point, like in 1807, 1808, 1809, two of the original guys are going to Stone and saying, you know, I'd like to make our ideas a little more formal. And you know what they wanted him to do? They wanted him to write a creed. And he said no. And you know what they said? We're going to be Presbyterians again. So there were the 5 guys that got kicked out. 2 became Shakers, 2 went back to being Presbyterians. There was just Stone and the other guy who joined him. So of the original 5, the only one who stayed with the movement was Barton Stone. They called themselves simply Christians. What did they believe? One of the things they came to believe very early on, that slavery was wrong. Part of the reason Stone was poor, besides he had 10 kids, when his mom died, he was given 2 slaves. He not only freed them, he paid for their education. His second wife, when her mom died, I believe she received 7 slaves. But because of the law of the state they lived in, which was a slave state, they couldn't be manumitted. So he simply moved them to Illinois, which is a free state. They went free, and then he came back. Stone was always bivocational. He had an education, he taught school, he farmed. I mean, he would take literally, I guess he had the Bible on the plow and would read it. He took his pen and paper out there, and if a thought came to him, he would write it down. Some of his congregation thought that that was beneath his dignity. They wanted a full-time pastor. They said, fine, we'll have a pledge campaign. We'll pay off your farm. This is from Dr. Williams and the Stone Campbell movement. Hard times hit. You know how on our website it says, if giving your pledge would cause you to experience financial hardship, we encourage you not to? We weren't the first Christians to do that. People had come up, we're going to pay off Pastor Stone's farm, and then they didn't. And so he had a difficult time making a go of it. And they ended up believing in baptism of adults by immersion, or at least of believers by immersion. Stone was immersed, but they weren't in people's face about it like Alexander Campbell and his disciples would believe. One of the things that we're going to talk about in the next 2 weeks is you've got Barton Stone and the Christians, and Alexander Campbell and the disciples. And they shared 2 things in common. They both abhorred the disunity of the church. Indeed, this is interesting. Again, people came to America. It was the new order of the ages. It was a new experience. And even though, certainly from a perspective of a slave, it wasn't utopia. But there were immigrants who felt, coming out of the repressive systems they had been in, coming here, getting free land or cheap land at least, and being able to clear it, make a living of your own, determine your own way, elect your own leaders. This was progress. But what would be every Sunday we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You ever read in Revelation about the millennium? Not something disciples talk about much. But the millennium is the idea that Jesus will reign on the earth in glory for 1,000 years. Stone and many of his followers felt, golly, we got things pretty good in the United States of America right now. It may not be too much longer till the millennium happens. But why isn't it happening? Because of the division of the churches. And this sounds naive. This is You remember that Woodrow Wilson actually believed World War I was the last war that was ever going to be fought? Stone believed that if you could unite the churches all back together, Jesus would come back and reign. And that sounds silly to us, but that's what was believed. So I digress. You have the disciples under Campbell, the Christians under Stone. They both abhorred the lack of unity in the church. And they both felt the way to become unified again was to go back to the Bible and look at what the New Testament church did. And they felt since reasonable people read the same Bible, they would all come to the same reasonable conclusion, which of course was the conclusion that they had. But unity, New Testament primitivism, can't say that word right, going back to the New Testament. Stone's people, the Christians, and Campbell's people, the disciples, both believed that. But they had different emphasis. Campbell's people were basically, we believe in the unity of the church, and you can unify by becoming like us. Stone's people were, we think we have the right pattern also, and we'd like to unify. But take a look at us. Give us a look. They were more into the unity than to the going back to the New Testament aspect. And Campbell's people were more into the going back to New Testament than the unity. And that will come up in some degree next week. Stone had a journal, the Christian Messenger, that he wrote. Now, none of this happened in a vacuum. Stone and the Christians were working up in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Alexander Thomas Campbell and Walter Scott were working. And it was in the early 1820s that Stone and Alexander Campbell met. And they began to notice that they had similarities of belief. Now, in 1823, and for a few more years, Thomas and Alexander Campbell were still officially Baptists. And I put quotation marks around it because they had a lot of ideas that Baptists didn't. But they were officially Baptists. And so, as long as they were in the Baptist fold, Stone was a man who left a denomination. He wasn't going to pair up with a Baptist. But finally, the Campbells and the Baptists, about 1829, 1830, split. And that's when Stone saw his opportunity. Again, he was the unity guy, and Campbell was, let's get back to the Bible guy. So Stone started pushing in his journal, we ought to get together. We ought to get together. Have you ever met couples, one really wanted to get married and the other was lukewarm? That's kind of how they were. Stone was the guy, come on, Alexander, let's join up. And again, Campbell, from his viewpoint, was, yeah, but Stone's the guy that years ago had these funny ideas about the atonement. He had funny ideas about the Trinity. Do we want to pair up with him? And so it went back and forth, and they didn't even really like each other, because they were very different. Stone was poor. What was Campbell? Rich. Alexander Campbell did what every pastor should do. You know what that was? Marry a woman whose family was independently wealthy and have your father-in-law set you up. Later on, we'll talk about Alexander Campbell hated clergy. He thought that every elder should be able to go up and preach a sermon, which in the theory is not a bad idea, but wait a second. He had the product of a European private education. He never had to work a day in his life because he married this wealthy woman. He didn't have to depend on a church for money. He had the money. He was a wealthy man. Barton Stone had to plow out on the Bible. Stone went to the log cabin academy. Campbell went to a European school. Stone was an effective communicator, but he wasn't very polished. Campbell, as we'll talk about next week, was in philosophical debates with presidents of the United States. They were simply at a different point in life. Now, absolutely, Stone started before Campbell. The last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery was 1804. Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell, and Walter Scott were all still in Europe. Absolutely, Stone had the claim of priority. He wanted Campbell to acknowledge, we have the same ideas, but I was first. And Alexander Campbell was pretty, he thought well of himself. He didn't want to concede the point, well, yeah, you have the idea, but we brought it to perfection. And so, if it had been up to Campbell, the merger never would have happened. And finally, sides got to talking. And it was on January 1st, 1832, that for the Christians, the Stone people, it was Barton W. Stone that was there. For the Campbell people, they weren't there. You know, that they sent a man named Raccoon John Smith. Yeah. And you know how when I jokingly talked a few Sundays ago about, you know, we used to have the right hand of Christian fellowship and now we have the right elbow of Christian fellowship. I'm not sure if that term came from there. But the merger wasn't signed by people signing a contract. It was signed when Raccoon John Smith and Barton W. Stone exchanged the right hand of Christian fellowship. And that's how our merger took place. But these are both loose associations of people. That's the whole point. They're free. If I run a loose group of churches and somebody else runs a loose group of churches and they say, hey, we're going to get together, is everybody going to agree with that? So there were people that Stone could not get in. There were people that Campbell couldn't get in. But the merger took place. Now, again, Alexander Campbell had a forceful personality. A forceful personality. And the difference is, pretty much Campbell won most of them. On the name, Campbell wanted disciple. Stone wanted Christians. What did we end up with? The Christian Church Disciples of Christ. They could never agree. Now, one of the things you hear, maybe not as much as you used to, but if you come to a Disciples of Christ church for communion, if you're Catholic, can you take our communion? If you're Episcopalian, can you take our communion? Yep. If you're Eastern Orthodox? Yep. Where do you think that idea came from? Campbell or Barton Stone? It came from Barton Stone. Campbell was like, you people haven't been baptized for the remission of sins in our water. You're not Christians. Don't come to our table. And Stone won that, but only because Campbell's father and Walter Scott took Stone's side. But that happened in 1832. Stone lived 12 more years. Anyone know the state that Barton Stone died in? Missouri. He had gone on a preaching mission in central Missouri and got sick and was going to head home. He got as far as Hannibal and passed away there. I would dare say of the four founding fathers of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, that in our era, that Stone is the hero. And certainly it wasn't always that way. That, you know, in years past, I mean, Stone was kind of the left out one, because Alexander Campbell and his folks so dominated the merger. But since it's always interesting, where an organization founded the idea of bringing Christians together. When was the last merger we had? 1832. Now, we've talked to other churches, but, you know, never got married. How many other denominations were spawned by this group? 2. The Churches of Christ split off. The independent Christian churches split off. And I can't be sure. I visited independent Christian churches. I visited Churches of Christ. But I've never been a member, I can't say. I'm guessing if you were to go there, they would put a lot more emphasis on Alexander and Thomas Campbell as people who restored the New Testament church. And if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else. And the disciples of Christ, we still take communion every Sunday. It's open to all. We still baptize by immersion. But if you were sprinkled as a Methodist or a Catholic, can you join here? Those things came from Barton Stone. And perhaps the other part of the movement would see Thomas and Alexander Campbell, particularly Alexander and Walter Scott, as their founders. And our side of the movement, probably our founder, is Barton Warren Stone. Any questions? Yes?
There's a whole bunch of change in like one generation. Like to go from like the Presbyterians to bad Presbyterians to we're on our own to we've got this churches to we're joining. That's like a whole lot of change for these people in a very short period of time.
Let me give you an example. You're absolutely right. If you lived in East Germany in 1985, did you ever think that life would change? And 4 years later, the wall fell. 2 years later, the Soviet Union fell. Germany was unified. That happened in a very, very, very short period, shorter than this. You're right, a lot of changes happened. But sometimes history doesn't move slowly. And this is one of the times. Any other questions? Comments, funny stories? Now, I say this is treated medically. If I come back with a shiner on the other side next week, people might wonder. So we've talked about Barton Stone and the Christians this week. Next week, we're going to talk about Alexander Campbell, Thomas Campbell, and Walter Scott. Not much about Walter Scott. Lynn and some other people heard me talk about Walter Scott in the odds and ends class. He may be kind of the forgotten founder. I'll give you a little hint how the story's going to go. Any of you remember the late Congressman John Lewis, who just passed away a year or so ago? Do you remember his expression for what he did in life? He caused good trouble. Good trouble. That's next week's title, Good Trouble, because that's certainly what the Campbells did. See you next week, folks. Oh, question?
Can I ask you a question?
Certainly.
This is just kind of boiling around in my head. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm going to tell the story correctly, but this is a story about my grandfather,
Certainly.
who was a member of this church.
Yes.
So I don't know how, I obviously wasn't alive when this happened, so I'm not exactly sure, but he married my grandmother,
Yep.
who was a Presbyterian. I'm telling it wrong. I'm telling it the opposite. He was a member of this church. She was a Presbyterian. let me back up. Let me start over. It's still boiling around in my head. Okay, he was a Presbyterian. She belonged to this church. They wanted to get married. So he was going to join our church. But he had been sprinkled,
Right.
and not immersed. So the story I always heard was that the Liberty Christian Church was not going to let him become a member
Right.
until he got immersed.
Right.
So we're talking about the early 1900s. I don't exactly know, 1910, 1915, something like that, I'm guessing. So from what you said, so he put up a big stink about it.
Yeah.
And he was allowed to join the church. So I'm
Without being immersed.
without being immersed.
And that's how it always. Okay. Let me. Thank you, Pam.
I'm just confused about that.
Let me tell you my own story. My father was baptized a Presbyterian as a baby, maybe not as a baby, but as a small child. My mother was Methodist. When they got married, she became Methodist. We went to a Methodist church when I was little, and then in 1966 we moved to Gladstone, 3 houses from Fairview Christian Church. And any of you know James Allen Nichols? He's still alive. One of the great honors of my life, in 1966 I was James Allen's pastor, and in 2020, James Allen Nichols. I became his pastor. His son invited me to sing in the church choir, which I did. And we decided to go to Fairview. In 1967, unless you were immersed, you couldn't join Fairview. And indeed, as he got older in years, James Allen gave me his ministerial directory that's still at Fairview. All the people he immersed who had been baptized before, but not by immersion. So in 1968, to join Fairview, my parents had to be rebaptized. And about 1969, they changed it. But that was a church-by-church thing. And the story you tell, Pam, about your grandpa making a stink is so classic. When I became a pastor in 1984, I went to the First Christian Church of Hiawatha, Kansas, which was very conservative. And they still had what was called closed membership. And what we have now is open membership. And you had to be immersed to be a member. There was a wonderful older couple, part of the United Church of Christ, great people, who were coming to our church, mid to late 80s. And by golly, they wanted to join. And part of the reason I wanted to go into do interim ministries when I retired as a physician is because the guy who was interim at Hiawatha before I was so cool. He was a devil-may-care kind of horrible installed pastor, perfect interim minister because, like John Lewis said, he liked good trouble. So they went to Reverend Gideon, and said, we'd like to join, but we're in our 80s. We don't want to. And Hiawatha had the most awful baptistry you could ever meet. You couldn't heat it. Can we join without being baptized again? So Jay went to the board of elders, and they all said yes, except one guy said, no, we are closed membership. They can't join. Now, most of you remember the old days when the invitation was right at the very end of the service. You had communion, then you had the sermon, and then there was the invitation, and after that you saying, God be with you till we meet again, and went on your merry way. It was after I had been called, but before I'd been started. It was Reverend Gideon's last Sunday. He claims he didn't plan this. But whatever hymn they sang, softly and tenderly, he gives the invitation, and this old couple comes forward. Does he receive them into the church by profession of faith and tell them that they're going to have to be baptized? No. He extends the right hand of Christian fellowship, join the First Christian Church. And then he's done. True story. And that's what I loved about Jay Gideon. And so the elders get back together. And I guess they give Jay heck for doing this. But But at the same time, the one guy says, we can't have this happen. Apparently in the meeting said, what are we going to do about this? And another old farmer said, we're not going to do anything or I'm leaving. And so we got our first 2 non-immersed members. So Steve Regas becomes pastor. And this brouhaha had just taken place. And so I bring up the point, you know, there are most disciple churches by 1984 are open membership. What if somebody has joined? You remember when the Army had Don't Ask, Don't Tell? What if somebody is a member of another disciple church and they want to transfer here, but they've never been immersed? And they basically said, don't ask, don't tell. So we had, in the next 2 years, we had two men who, one was, I believe, raised Catholic, one was raised Methodist, who'd married disciples, become disciples, but had never been immersed. So again, I accept the membership. They become deacons. So we have closed membership. We have 4 members who haven't been immersed, including 2 deacons. And finally, in 1980s, it's one of those things that people in churches put off because, well, if we do this, somebody might leave. Somebody might quit giving. So finally in 1986, we took the bull by the horns, my board chair and I, and we brought it to a vote. And the vote was 89% in favor of open membership. And nobody left. And that's how it happened in most churches. By 1986, probably 30%, 70% were open membership, but they probably contained 95% of the members. I think it would be very, very, very hard pressed in all 3,000 of our churches to find a single closed membership church, because most of the ones who believe that would have already left over something else. So that's a long answer to your question, Pam, but that story was repeated in hundreds and thousands of churches. And the ones that didn't go along became independent Christian churches, where the rule is still no baptized in our water, you don't get to join. Anything else?
So it was up to the individual church.
Absolutely, it was up to as everything is.
And so there's nothing written any place about it?
Not as only is there nothing written about it. When we were talking about doing it in Hiawatha, they had a hard time getting good numbers because it's the kind of thing Indianapolis didn't want to draw attention to. That nobody really did surveys about what was going on, because so much of it, like my church, like your grandpa, was done under the table. That people somehow got in and finally you play the hypocrisy game long enough and said, oh, come on, let's just come clean. Let's become open membership. There's nothing at the, and again, here's another question. When Fairview went to open membership in 1970 roughly, the idea was, and I'll use my cousins as an example. My aunt and uncle came to Fairview in 1970-71. When we had open membership, all 4 of them had been sprinkled. My aunt and uncle obviously had been confirmed. My older cousin, 2 years older than me, had been confirmed. He was like 14. My younger cousin hadn't. And the rule was, okay, the 3 people have been confirmed can join. But if you haven't been confirmed, then you have to go through our whole process. And that's a problem that I think disciple churches still face. What do you do with a kid? You know, if you're an adult who's been sprinkled and you're a member, that's fine. But what about a 7-year-old who comes here and is raised in our tradition but was sprinkled as a child? I mean, I was never taught in seminary how to confirm somebody. What do you do? So anyways, why don't you ask Culver that question? Because I think he's actually dealt with it. Thank you all.